We just got back from some of the best experimentation conferences in the world. We got to talk with the teams at companies like Netflix, Amazon, Meta, TikTok, and there were some interesting conversations that kept coming up. Smart people thinking along similar lines, and seems pretty certain that these are going to be major topics in experimentation in 2025. I've got Shay with me. We're going to bring you into the room on those conversations and let you in on exactly where the boundary pushing is going to happen in experimentation next year. We can summarize it pretty quickly, and these sound like perennial topics, but I think we've got some interesting takes on each that'll be a little bit different. Everyone is always talking about how do we run more experiments. Everyone's always talking about how do we run experiments in more places, and then how do we do more trustworthy, like executive level reporting on experimentation. I think there's some new ideas in all three of these categories. So that's what we're going to dive into today on Outperform. So Shay, maybe let's just start with the running more experiments topic. In the past, this has meant everything from statistical techniques to variance reduction to SDKs and client side versus server side discussions, but it seems like there's a pretty different flavor of more experiments popping up lately, which is thinking about automation and workflows and UI UX. Maybe you can give the high level here and then we can dive in.
Yeah, definitely. When I reflect on this year of conversations, the commonality, whether it's among executives, whether it's among operators, is just throughput. Just how many experiments can you get through the barrel? How many ideas can you get to market that will inflect your business? And, I think up for a while in the experiment landscape, people have been primarily bottlenecked on just very basic integration problems. And certainly that's the case depending on what choice you've made of buy versus build. But, as the vendor landscape gets better, as sophistication gets better, there's kind of it's a new frame of reference for experiment throughput. So there's a few elements of this. One is just how self-serve can it be for an engineer to go end to end? When you look at the best companies, an engineer does not have to consult with an experiment committee or any kind of bureaucratic group to understand what are all the protocols for running an experiment. They should just be able to get started, be like, okay, cool, here's all the metrics, here's how we think about metrics, and then I can make a decision at the end and launch it. So, one is just really embracing the world of self-serve. The second is around automation, where, if you take the logical extension of what I just said, of if someone comes up with an idea, they get it to market, and then all the protocols of how we're going to make a decision, how we're going to learn from it are kind of preset and baked, then automation is a very logical next step. So I call it, I firmly believe 2025 is the year of auto experiments, where you set it and forget it. You set the things up, and then, the platforms can monitor, adjudicate, and just kind of inform you of what happens, which again will really massively speed up throughputs. And then the third thing is a bit more provocative. One of my favorite papers out of MIT Code this year was from the Netflix team, where they showed that at least among Netflix, they are better off getting more ideas to market, even if it means taking some shortcuts on the kind of false positive rates or false negative rates or rigor around it. That is to say, if to run an experiment with the kind of more traditional boundaries, a p-value 0.05 and certain amounts of statistical sample size, if doing those standards means you get fewer ideas to market, it actually ends up worse for the business, because every idea has unbounded upside and you want to get as many of them out there as possible. So when we talk about experiment throughput, it just turns out more ideas to market faster is just a huge win for the business.
Yeah, so let's go through each of those three things, because I think they all warrant a little exploration. The self-serve one, maybe not surprising that we're kind of all just collectively ending up here now, because I think for a long time a lot of teams thought that an experimentation center of excellence was the pinnacle of how to do this, and then as we all matured collectively, we kind of realized it becomes a bottleneck of its own at some point. So I guess what are some of the roadblocks today in your example, an engineer to run an experiment end to end totally self-serve? what are the parts of that process that aren't self-serve today, and what would it, hypothetically look like to become self-serve?
Yeah, I think a lot of this is that if you're like a 2, 3, 4 year tenure engineer who like didn't come from a statistical background or anything, or maybe just don't know the org, you just kind of don't know what you don't know in terms of setting these things up. So a basic thing will be, if I want to get an experiment up and running, like, do I need someone's approval to do so? Or do I not need someone's approval to do so? Like, that is a basic permission structure that can just be not super clear. The second thing is, if I want to get it out, what is the safe rollout procedure? What do people do to make sure releases are hygienic? So does that mean always starting with like a 5% sample, or only with internal employees, or what? Just what are the steps to do it so that kind of managers feel good about the UX that arrives on the market? And then third thing is, like, once your experiment is up and running, I think a lot of the more modern platforms have gotten pretty good at monitoring and diagnostics, making sure the experiment's healthy. But for all of the kind of rigor and diagnostics around experiments running okay, the process of making a decision off an experiment is still completely manual and, beholden to some kind of narrow circle of experiment committees and metric committees and stuff like that. Where if you look at places like Airbnb, it was just very clear that make sure bookings goes up, make sure 5-star ratings is not going down. If you look at places like Netflix, it's, make sure time on Netflix is going up, make sure subscriptions are, flats are going up. There's a sort of simplicity to how decisions are made that just really increases throughput. So the kind of formalization of just like, okay, you made a change and a bunch of metrics moved. What happens next? Right now, it's kind of going through sort of written down policies and experiment committees, but they're just large classes of experiments that are pretty much the same, that you can kind of standardize how the decisions are going to get made.
So this is where we're starting to bleed into automation then. We're talking about essentially pre-registering decisions based on different possible combinations of metric outcomes, and just getting rid of a whole potential, I imagine a Jira ticket stage called like analysis, where an idea could sit for weeks after an experiment that we're just kind of getting rid of by aligning on action in advance.
Totally. And, it can be a bit uncomfortable for many companies to get to that stage, to be like, surely, like, we're going to miss something, the automation will miss something. And so, every company is going to have some stepping stone period where first try a formalization of rules, but still have a sort of manual, okay, this looks good, check, check, check. But I think we're just starting to now see companies that are sort of realizing we can actually just formalize the policy. It is not a case that we have to treat every experiment as a, one-off snowflake that requires a lot of babysitting. Like, we can actually take a huge class of experiments and make them just kind of funnel through.
Yeah. I think the other thing we're hearing from all these companies, and you alluded to it, but it's probably worth making explicit, is the answers to all of these questions, even when they are formalized, like, do I need to get approval for this experiment? What do the metrics need to be? Whatever. They may be documented today in a mature organization. I'm sure plenty of organizations still need to do some work on their internal documentation. But what we're talking about now is going beyond that to kind of productizing flows for this. So it's not even a matter of searching the internal documentation to answer what do I do at this step.
That's exactly it. Experiment committees should be built into the platform. Put another way, like, experiment committees or any center of excellence or any sort of place where we're going to take high complexity decisions, like, they shouldn't be operating at an experiment level. They should be operating at a policy level. So instead of like, adjudicating individual experiments, just say, as a whole, as all of Netflix or Airbnb or whatever your company is, this is how we think about these decisions.
Yeah. I mean, we've kind of hit a point where we need to set up governance at scale, and we can't just keep adding people to the experimentation team to keep.
That's exactly it. And it's one of those cases where actually kind of rigor and speed go hand in hand. Because, the funny thing is, the entire world of statistics like assumed you were going to pre-register your decisions.
Sure.
When people talk about, multiple hypothesis control, and when people talk about, even doing a power analysis, whatever, there's just an assumption. It's like, oh yeah, this is how a decision is going to get made. And yet somehow, organizations will run those things, but not actually, follow any preordained decision. So I think this is a place where, like, the process of saying what is the decision policy going to be ends up boosting both rigor and speed.
Yeah. And then you touched on the very controversial horizon just beyond this, which is
Yeah.
what do we need to rethink in the statistical guidelines themselves? And I agree, the paper and work that Netflix
Yeah.
presented at MIT's conference this year were kind of mind blowing. But there is that question being asked: is the biggest opportunity cost or the biggest risk like a false negative by default because we didn't test it, and our false positives really, really, really low risk or low costs in comparison?
Totally. It's funny. Everyone who starts learning about statistics comes away being like, why p-value 0.05? Why, alpha, 0.8? Like it's these rules of thumb that are basically like, these things basically work. Why mess with them? But if you start to think of them as parameters to tune for just what is the best fit for your org, it just becomes a very different decision process.
Yeah.
So
We
I
should probably
think
be explicit. That was the work that Netflix was presenting, was a decision theoretic approach to this based on the actual distribution of their experiments at Netflix. It wasn't like, purely making up
yeah,
new guidelines or thresholds. It was based on what they actually see in the field. And, maybe that differs for different companies, but it's an interesting time to be thinking about some of this stuff. I know
exactly.
there are plenty of people, myself included, who have had varying degrees of uh, extremism in their feelings about like the whole A/B testing with fat tails world or viewpoint. Definitely seems like there's a couple companies who are bringing empirical evidence to say like we think this is
Yeah,
more true than not.
that's right.
Cool. Well, throughput definitely going to be a big topic. I know it's something we're thinking a lot about. EPO, the productization of some of that governance at scale stuff, and folks will hear a lot more from us in the very near future on that front. But for now, maybe let's move on to the second point here, which is just running experiments on a wider surface area or answering more business questions with experimentation, maybe in places where a traditional A/B test or randomized controlled experiment isn't possible. Set
Yeah.
the stage for us here a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. I think, one of the things that happened with experimentation, especially for the people who use legacy vendors, is you kind of just thought the only places you should be experimenting are the places where technologically you could experiment. It's like, well, we have a tool that lets us experiment on a marketing website. So I guess experimentation is just marketing website experimentation. It was just this kind of like weird leap that kind of happened. When in fact, if you look at the places like the Airbnb's, Netflix is, certainly my time at Airbnb, experimentation was much more about where are the most important places to be experimental, and then how do we be experimental there, given the constraints. Perhaps
Yep.
we can't randomize at a user level. Perhaps this is around some internal org change or something like that. And it just turns out like everything else you can design an intervention in a way that gains signal and apply the appropriate metrics and stats to it. So, we're seeing this already happen with, one of the most common large problems at an organization of marketing channel spend, where, tracking marketing channel spend has always been a huge issue. I remember at most recently at Webflow, we were spending like $50 million a year on like YouTube spend, and we had basically no way to track it, because it turns out you don't click on YouTube ads, you just watch them, and then you don't have any first party data to understand attribution.
Sure.
But there's other companies that spend billions on channel spend. People often spend way more on their channels than they do on their actual product team. So ipso facto, they're actually making bigger bets on marketing campaigns than they are on product launches. And yet that has always been, a tough place to experiment. So, it just turns out there's another way to be experimental, and that is the kind of geolift test, the kind of inflect spend or zero out spend in certain geographic regions, and then track the metrics using like synthetic control methods. But this can kind of extend to all sorts of classes of problems, right? There's like, if you're a retail company, a lot of your most important questions are in retail operations, and you can run experiments there. They call them pilots. They're basically experiments tracked in very similar ways. There's a lot of energy right now on adopting new AI tools for productivity. also called a pilot, also essentially an experiment. Are there tools that let you kind of do that more rigorously in ways that give you confidence to push everyone else on adoption? So I think the world of quasi experiments, which is basically a way of saying if you can't just run a literal randomized A/B test and you have to use other tools, um, I think that will continue to gain steam as people are focused on bringing experimental energy to the most important problems in the org.
Yeah. I mean, I'm probably biased in saying this, but I think this is another, place where the vendor landscape evolution is really unlocking a lot of the conversation for everyone who isn't an Airbnb or a Netflix
Mm-hmm.
or a Meta, because the companies that I consulted for 6-7 years ago, if they had thought in that sort of top down way in terms of what are the areas where we want to be experimental and then figure out how to design studies around those, like there was no PhD statistician in house to help answer those questions.
Yeah, I mean, and the big thing is like when you're no longer in the world of kind of randomized control trials, at least with randomized control trials, it's actually so simple that you can just hire like, you know, people who kind of just did a boot camp or something because the methods are
Sure.
so robust and so simple. When you're dealing with lower sample sizes and semi-randomized or non-randomized situations, you have to kind of add some structure to it. And then it starts to look a little bit like economics in terms of how you tackle these things. So this is where it just turns out these are the most important problems, so it's actually worth it to figure out how can you still be experimental on them.
Yeah, randomization takes care of a lot that you probably
A
don't think
lot.
about every day.
Randomization and sample size, those two things take care of a
Yeah,
lot.
absolutely. I guess we should probably get into some specifics here because I'm sure anyone listening to Outperform would love to talk about specific
Yeah.
types of quasi experiments. So, what are some of the big ones in terms of methods that keep coming up in these conversations? You mentioned
Yeah, I think
advertising
about use
spend.
cases a lot. I mean, I mentioned a few of them already. So, you think of channel spend tests. So, you have a large amount of marketing spend on some sort of channel that doesn't lend itself to clean attribution, and you want to run an experiment. Because you can't individually randomize users, what you can do is, differentially allocate spend on geographies and then see first if I zero out the spend in like Canada, Argentina, and Germany, how much do those metrics drop in response? Or if I double the spend in Mexico, France, and India, how much do those metrics change? Depending on your business, it might not be a country, it might be a DMA, like a certain metro region or something like that. But you basically do the same thing. Another one could be SEO tests, where the basic unit of measurement is a URL, and the URLs they have a very long tail, and so certain URLs are giving you a ton of traffic, and you can't just kind of randomize and assume it's all going to work out. Where again, you need a more specialized method. If you're a retail store and you have store uplift models, so suppose you're Subway and you're launching a new sandwich. Well, launching a new sandwich is a pretty high cost thing to do. You have to get supply chains, you got to train people, you got to market it. And it turns out to de-risk that whole thing, it's best to run a pilot. Pick a few retail locations that bring enough diversity of use of locations, run a pilot and see where the sandwich is most successful. Maybe it's best in urban areas versus rural areas. Maybe it's best in, best earlier in the day versus late in the day. You can kind of figure out a lot of things from these sorts of pilots. So, it just turns out there's kind of a pretty wide class of problems where you can't necessarily truly randomize, or even if you could, it's just expensive to set up. And so you only want to do it in a finite number of locations. And the way to still get viable signal out of it is to kind of add a bit of structure to allow the sample size to tell you more.
Yeah. And just to drop a breadcrumb here for more technical listeners, because I'm sure people will go do some Googling. But with these, when we're randomizing geographies or URLs, or I guess we're not randomizing them, but when we're splitting our interventions by geography or URL, now we're talking about constructing on the flip side of this synthetic controls,
Mm-hmm.
trying to find the URLs or metros or countries that are actually comparable to each other given our business context, observed buying behavior, and use some Bayesian inference magic to help construct those and reliably make inference from what we observe difference
Yeah.
wise between the two. All right, so then let's jump to the third and maybe most important point at the end of the day, because we have
Yeah.
to win buy-in for all of these experiments and quasi experiments, and that's, how do we bring more trustworthy meta level reporting on the impact of all this experimentation to the executive suite? And this is one where I
Yep.
think there's been a lot of interestingly extremely close parallel lines of thinking between
Yeah.
companies like Amazon and Netflix and Etsy, ourselves. This has
Yep.
been an interesting one, but set the stage, and then we can dive into the technical stuff.
Yeah, definitely. So, one of the questions I hear all the time is like, how do I get my company to be more experimental? Why aren't we running more experiments? And it's just interesting. If you talk to the execs, like a CPO specifically of a company, like there's one problem that irks them the most of all in terms of driving experiment adoption. And it is the problem that, hey, I have these 10 product pods who are claiming that they each move the bottom line by like 5 to 10%. And I can just look at my metrics, and there's no way that collectively the bottom line was moved to like 30%. There's just no way. And so, there's something wrong with this process. I don't know if it's the way the numbers are tracked or the way people are making decisions or whatever, but like, I don't know what the problem is, but I just know there's a problem. And, it kind of cuts to the meat of it, because like in the end, what you want out of an experiment program is that like, not just which individual ideas are good, but kind of which kind of whole practices are good and which teams and, initiatives are good, which ones have ROI. So what we've noticed is that up until maybe this past year, all the focus has been about the trustworthiness of an individual experiment, but there hasn't been much invested in the trustworthiness of a whole program. And I think that just has meaningfully changed, where, the advice used to be, hey, run a holdout group. Because, holdouts
Sure.
are this nice gold standard. And for everyone who doesn't know, a holdout group is saying like, let's experiment on the experiment program by taking some 10% of the traffic and giving them like no experiments at all, and then comparing them against a set of winning experiments to see what is the aggregate total impact. And holdouts continue to be great. If you can pull them off, highly encouraged, because they're kind of they give not just kind of aggregate impact, but aggregate impact over a long time. But the problem we're seeing over and over is like, at EPO, it's very, very easy to set up a holdout, and yet a lot of folks will not do it because it requires a large organizational commitment. Like your engineers all have to be committed to keeping a lot of feature flags open for a very long time, which can, and then have to clean it all up, and making sure that holdout group is bug free for a long period of time. So it just requires a certain kind of depth of commitment of keeping all these forking paths bug free. How do you have a trustworthy aggregate impact without a holdout is kind of one of the big questions on the market today. Our approach here is to say we think the world of Bayesian is actually a natural language for aggregate impact estimate, where this gets a little bit into the weeds, but because Bayesian is kind of primarily indexed on first that there's zero difference, and then varying levels of data convince you that the number could not be zero, it has a natural shrinkage factor that leads to more trustworthy aggregate impact. But overall, I think a lot of teams are now starting to realize, if I could show that all of this sound and fury in my experiment program is actually adding up to a trustworthy total amount of impact that can be, voiced around the executive team, then it actually unlocks so much cultural buy-in.
Yeah. And we should be clear, this is not just companies who are early in their experimentation journey who are finding it very costly and perhaps prohibitive to maintain and commit to holdouts. It is some of the largest and most mature experimentation programs in the world who are saying, look, obviously mathematically it's a gold standard, but practically, how often can we actually run holdouts? We need to have some sort of other approach to this. And that's why, for anyone who didn't attend MIT's conference on digital experimentation this year, you can, do some Googling and find some of the papers that were presented. But the team at Amazon presented a very, very similar method to what we built in EPO for using Bayesian inference to mitigate that, winner's curse and all of those other reasons why you can't just add up the impact of all of your winning experiments and claim that that's your aggregate impact. So it's been interesting to see how many different companies are thinking along the same lines and
Yep.
kind of knocking on Bay's door, as it were, to find a solution here.
Yeah, and I'm excited to see what other solutions might eventually reach the market. I think the broader point is that we have gotten like very advanced and sophisticated at, tailoring experiment statistics on an individual experiment basis. Like, if you want to peak all the time, you can use sequential. If you want to index on the most power, like the fastest, like the tightest confidence intervals, you're probably going to end up with a fixed sample test or something like that. Like there's a lot of, you can use multiple hypothesis control on things. There's like a very serious treatment on the trustworthiness of an individual experiment, but there's just been very little serious statistical treatment of the aggregate impact score. And I think that is the thing that is most going to change, where, we might see a variety of approaches, each with their trade-offs and things, but the same amount of depth of inference going into an individual experiment will now apply to a whole program.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of upside to getting it right, like you said, right? Like at the end of the day, the continuation of the experimentation program kind of hinges on this at a certain point.
Yeah.
So, I mean, they feel like perennial conversations, right? Executive level impact reporting, running more experiments, covering more ground with experimentation. But I think these are all pretty new threads in each of those. And I'm excited to see them keep playing out over 2025 and get productized and keep getting discussed at conferences. I guess as we wrap up, is there anything from all of those that stands out to you as the most exciting personally?
I just think in general, it's just very exciting that a lot of the problems around just individual experiment execution, like now there's platforms, there's vendors, there's methods that are just kind of making them highly robust and repeatable. And it's just now helping us tackle the broader questions of how do you create an experimental business?
Yeah.
How do we create policies that dictate large swarms of experiments? And it couldn't come at a better time. The world of AI is something where we're going to see just a lot more ideas hit the market. It turns out, Copilot software, Cursor, using tools like Cursor, like helps you code so much faster, so you can build so much more software. It turns out, lots of Gen AI models that generate assets can make, campaigns produced faster. Like everything's about to go faster. And so we just really need our evaluation methods to keep pace.
Yeah, it's becoming an easier and easier time to be an experimenter or an experimentation end user, which means that there's a lot of fun challenges and a lot of upside for experimentation leaders right now to kind of capture as we keep up leveling how fast we can come up with ideas and build things and launch experiments.
Yep.
Hopefully this is interesting for folks to kind of come in on the room and get the sneak peek preview of what everyone's going to be talking about in 2025. If folks have questions about any of this stuff or want to talk about it further, absolutely reach out to Che or I on LinkedIn. We love keeping in touch with companies, big and small, whether you have a kind of sophisticated in-house platform or just getting started. It's always useful to hear perspectives on this stuff, and happy to send you links to any of the papers we referenced from Code this year or any other conference. But as always, thanks for listening to Outperform. Thanks for listening to this episode of Outperform. If you enjoyed the discussion and want more content about using experimentation to drive innovation and growth in your company, visit getepo.com/outperform. Your journey towards building a winning company and career starts here. Until next time, keep experimenting.